The streets of northern England in the mid-1970s carried a certain heaviness. Smoke from factory chimneys lingered above rows of red brick houses while narrow alleys glistened with damp rain. It was a world still shaped by industry where men worked long shifts and women often moved alone through the quiet neighborhoods after dusk. But beneath that everyday rhythm, something darker had begun to stir. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A woman attacked another, badly beaten whispers of a stranger in the shadows. The authorities logged the incidents, but did not yet see a pattern. These were working-class towns, after all. Violence was no stranger here. Yet for those who survived, the details carried a strange weight. The attacker's silence, the suddenness, the brutal force. It felt less like chance and more like ritual. By the time bodies began to appear lifeless in secluded corners, the uneasy truth pressed itself onto the community. Something was wrong, something far more sinister than random crime. People began locking their doors earlier, watching their daughters more closely. A single word passed quietly from mouth to mouth: Ripper. The shadow had arrived in Yorkshire. Northern England in the 1970s was a place suspended between tradition and change. Rows of soot-darkened houses leaned shoulder to shoulder along cobbled streets, their chimneys still coughing out smoke from factories that had seen better days. The hum of machinery and the grind of working shifts defined the rhythm of life, while pubs filled with tired men at the end of each week provided brief escapes from monotony. The region bore the marks of industry's decline, unemployment rising, families struggling, and communities balancing on a thin line between pride and despair. In these towns, Leeds, Bradford, Halifax, Huddersfield, Sheffield, the daily atmosphere carried something heavy. A drizzle seemed permanent mist gathering low across dimly lit streets. Women walked home from late shifts, their footsteps echoing against wet stone, while the glow from scattered street lamps left more shadows than safety. It was here in these ordinary settings that fear would slowly creep in, almost invisible at first. The first reports did not seem extraordinary. An assault on a woman in the quiet hours after midnight. Another badly beaten in an alleyway not far from home. Police took notes, filed paperwork, but the cases did not draw headlines. Northern towns were no strangers to violence, and brutality was often dismissed as random cruelty, the kind that came and went without further consequence. Investigators recorded witness accounts, vague descriptions of a dark figure, a quick attack, a blow to the head. They did not yet realize that these fragments belonged to the same hand. For those who survived the early encounters, the details carried something uncanny. There was no robbery, no theft, nothing stolen to explain the violence. The attacks were sudden, silent, and driven by a force that seemed almost ritualistic. It was as though someone had chosen the act itself as the prize. In the bleakness of 1970s Yorkshire, where poverty and unemployment often fueled short bursts of street crime, this difference should have stood out. But the larger picture had not yet been drawn. As weeks turned into months, whispers grew louder. Women spoke of being followed. Men told stories in pubs of friends, sisters, and wives attacked without reason. Local newspapers printed small columns, another assault on local woman, always brief, tucked between labour disputes and council announcements. And still the sense of unease grew. By 1975, the change was undeniable. A young woman's body was found lifeless, brutally attacked in a manner eerily similar to the earlier assaults. Unlike the cases before, this one could not be ignored. It was no longer an incident of survival, it was murder. Police could not pass it off as a drunken quarrel or random brutality. The community began to realize what they were facing. Someone was hunting women in their own streets. Fear has a way of spreading faster than fact. The mention of a killer carried weight, and when patterns began to appear, victims often women working late, some involved in prostitution, others simply walking home alone, the story gained shape. A predator existed among them, and the randomness made him even more terrifying. One victim, a sex worker; the next, a student nurse. There was no certainty, only the creeping dread that anyone might be next. Northern England was no stranger to infamous criminals. History still carried echoes of Jack the Ripper, the faceless killer of London, whose name had haunted the late 19th century. And now, nearly a century later, whispers connected the two. Journalists, always eager for a headline, latched on to the comparison. Soon the words were printed in bold black letters across the front pages: Yorkshire Ripper. The nickname gave the fear a face even before the police had one. Mothers warned their daughters, men escorted wives home from night shifts, and yet the sense of danger could not be contained. The Ripper, whoever he was, moved through familiar neighbourhoods unseen, slipping into the fog and rain of Yorkshire nights. Inside police headquarters, the mood shifted. What had once seemed like scattered assaults now appeared as a grim mosaic. Detectives began charting maps, connecting the dots between incidents. The realization was slow, but each connection deepened the weight pressing upon them. They were dealing with a serial killer. Still, disagreements persisted. Some officers argued the early cases were unrelated. Others insisted the pattern was clear. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the initial hesitation, those lost months of scattered focus, allowed the Ripper the confidence to strike again. And strike he did. With each attack, his violence escalated. Each discovery of a new body rippled through Yorkshire like a shockwave. The police presence thickened in certain districts, but he remained elusive. The towns carried on by day factories running buses, rolling shops opening, but after nightfall, fear descended like a second skin. The air seemed colder, the streets emptier, as if the entire region was holding its breath. The contrast between the ordinariness of daily life and the monstrosity of the crimes amplified the terror. He was not a ghost, not a shadow. He was a man, someone who lived among them. Perhaps a neighbour, perhaps the quiet man in the corner of the pub, perhaps the driver of a passing lorry. The uncertainty bound everyone together in unease. Each face in the crowd carried the potential to belong to him. By the end of that first year of murders, Yorkshire was transformed. What had begun as isolated incidents had become a looming nightmare. The Ripper was not only taking lives, he was reshaping the rhythm of communities, altering the way people walked, talked, and trusted each other. In the north of England, where resilience was a point of pride, fear had become an unwelcome guest at every doorstep. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the man responsible, Peter Sutcliffe, lived his ordinary life. He worked shifts, drove his truck, spoke with neighbours, and sat at the family table. To those around him, nothing seemed out of place. The mask of normalcy was perfect, and it would remain intact for years, even as the death toll rose. For now, though, in the late 1970s, Yorkshire had only the shadow of a name. The Ripper, a word passed in hushed tones, shared with dread, etched into newspaper ink, and whispered on the lips of those who wondered if they would survive the night. The earliest known victims of the man who would become the Yorkshire Ripper were for a long time treated as footnotes. Their names did not echo across headlines the way later victims would. Instead, their stories lived in whispers, in short police reports, and in memories that faded far too quickly. Yet in those first assaults, the pattern was already present: the brutality, the suddenness, and the sense that something far darker was beginning. It was 1969 when the first known attack occurred. The victim, a young woman walking home alone, was struck with a hammer. She survived, though barely, and her injuries left her shaken for life. In her account to police, she remembered little beyond the sound of approaching footsteps, the sharp pain, and the chilling silence of her attacker. He said nothing. He demanded nothing. He simply vanished back into the darkness. The case was written off as random street violence. No suspect was caught. Another woman around the same time was also attacked in similar circumstances. She too survived, though, with serious injuries. Again, there was no robbery, no clear motive. To investigators, these cases belonged in a separate category from murder. They were logged and forgotten. But the connections were their connections that hindsight would later scream were obvious. As the years progressed, the attacks grew bolder. In 1975, Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother of 4, became the first recognized murder victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. She was found in Leeds, her body left in a field near her home. She had been struck repeatedly with a hammer and stabbed. The violence was shocking, but the circumstances late at night, a woman walking home, were not unusual in an area where vulnerability was part of life. Still, the brutality of the murder suggested something beyond a drunken rage. It was controlled, deliberate, almost practiced. Wilma's death shook the community, but it did not yet shake the system. Police launched an investigation, canvassed the area, interviewed witnesses, but with limited resources and no clear leads, progress stalled. The case joined the growing pile of unsolved files. In January 1976, another body was discovered, Emily Jackson, a 42-year-old part-time sex worker from Leeds. She had been lured into a car, beaten with a hammer, and stabbed repeatedly. The savagery of the attack left no doubt of intent. For the first time, investigators began to suspect that a single killer might be responsible for both McCann and Jackson. The whispers of a pattern began to stir within the police ranks, but not everyone agreed. Some detectives dismissed the theory, insisting that street violence against vulnerable women was not uncommon. Others argued that the details, the hammer, the stabbing, the sheer ferocity, were too specific to ignore. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the reluctance to connect the early cases came from professional caution or from the bias of the time. After all, many victims were women on the margins of society, sex workers, single mothers, those living in poverty. Their lives were often judged as dangerous, their deaths seen as unfortunate but not extraordinary. This dismissal allowed the killer room to breathe. He could strike again, confident that confusion and hesitation shielded him. And he did. Marcella Claxton, another woman attacked, in 1976 managed to survive. She was struck from behind with a hammer while walking home. Bleeding heavily, she managed to crawl for help. Her testimony, had it been properly considered, could have been the breakthrough investigators needed. She described a man with dark hair, medium build, driving a car, but her statement was filed, pushed aside, and eventually forgotten. The investigation moved forward, but without momentum, as if caught in a fog of disbelief. For Yorkshire women, however, disbelief was no longer an option. The attacks had moved from rumour to grim reality. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Men began escorting wives and girlfriends home from bus stops. The streets, once familiar, became hunting grounds. Fear reshaped daily life, pressing down like the industrial smog that already hung heavy over the region. By 1977, the Ripper had claimed more lives. Irene Richardson, Jane MacDonald, and others would follow. Each case added weight to the growing dread, yet the killer's identity remained hidden. He was not a shadow anymore. He was a pattern, a rhythm of violence pulsing through the north. And still the system struggled to keep pace. The early victims, those who survived and those whose deaths were first recorded, carried warnings in their stories. Warnings ignored, overlooked, or buried in bureaucracy. Their voices should have been enough to spark urgency. Instead, they became quiet echoes in the background of a storm that had only just begun. By 1977, the city of Leeds had already shifted under the shadow of violence. The mills still worked, the buses still rolled along wet cobblestone streets, and the pubs still filled with voices at night, but beneath the hum of routine there was a current of fear. Women checked over their shoulders more often, footsteps carried new urgency, and neighborhoods grew quieter after dark. In the back of people's minds lingered the knowledge that someone out there was choosing his victims deliberately, and he had not been caught. The murder of Jane MacDonald marked a turning point. She was only 16, a shop assistant returning home after a night out with friends. Unlike previous victims, Jane was not connected to sex work, nor did she live on the fringes of society. She was young, ordinary, and respectable by the standards of the time. Her death shattered the notion that the killings were confined to a certain class of women. The Ripper had widened his circle. The discovery of her body sent shockwaves through Yorkshire. The press seized on the tragedy, amplifying public fear. Mothers warned their daughters not to go out alone, and the idea that the Ripper could strike anyone began to take hold. For investigators, this was both a shift and a confirmation the killer was escalating and the illusion of safety through respectability no longer held. Meanwhile, the police force was under strain. Hundreds of officers were involved in the investigation, combing through evidence, interviewing witnesses, and following leads. Files piled high, names of suspects filled lists, but the connections slipped through their grasp. The investigation began to take on the qualities of an industrial machine, vast, complicated, and increasingly clogged. One strange detail that surfaced during this time was the killer's methodical use of a hammer, followed by stabbing. It was not only effective, but oddly ritualistic, as though the act itself carried significance beyond the violence. Some detectives wondered aloud if the Ripper was working through a psychological compulsion, a pattern that held him as tightly as it terrorized his victims. Investigators and criminologists are still debating whether these repeated methods reflected habit necessity or a twisted form of satisfaction. Another unsettling element was the geography. The attacks did not occur in one confined area, but spread across West Yorkshire from Leeds to Bradford and beyond. The killer seemed to move with ease through urban streets, suburban estates, and isolated fields. He blended into the everyday life of the region, hiding in plain sight. Detectives speculated that he might be someone with local knowledge, perhaps a driver, someone who knew the terrain intimately. Despite the growing number of bodies, the Ripper remained invisible. Police interviewed thousands of men, even bringing in known offenders and sex workers' clients. But the sheer scale of the operation overwhelmed the system. Record-keeping was slow, reliant on paper and index cards, and coordination between divisions often broke down. Each new murder added urgency, but also noise clouding the investigation with overlapping trails. The public's patience began to thin. Rumours swirled, pointing to strangers in pubs, neighbours with odd habits, or men seen lurking in parked cars. Vigilantism simmered under the surface. Some women carried makeshift weapons, while groups of men patrolled neighbourhoods in the hope of catching the Ripper themselves. The tension was palpable, the kind that seeped into daily routines and coloured every corner of ordinary life. Then came the murder of Marilyn Moore, who survived her attack. Her account described a man with a beard and dark hair driving a car. It was a detail that matched earlier testimony, yet the information seemed to vanish into the sea of reports. Each fragment of truth scattered across witness statements, and police files lay waiting for someone to stitch them together. No one had the thread. In homes across Yorkshire, conversations grew hushed and worried. Fathers spoke of escorting their daughters. Mothers counted the minutes until their children returned home. Entire communities shifted into a state of guarded vigilance. The Ripper was no longer just a criminal haunting the newsprint. He was a presence woven into the fabric of life. Through it all, he remained at large, calm, and unhurried. The police, with all their manpower and resources, were chasing a figure who seemed to know the limits of their system better than they did. His violence continued unchecked, and the weight of fear settled deeper into the streets of northern England. By the end of 1977, the case had taken on a life of its own. The press fed the public with headlines speculating on motives, identities, and methods, while police departments across Yorkshire scrambled to contain the chaos. The murders continued, leaving investigators reeling, each crime scene a mirror of the last a woman left beaten, stabbed, discarded under the cover of darkness. The questions grew heavier. Why this pattern? Why these victims? And why was the killer always one step ahead? Then came the letters. They arrived at police stations and newspaper offices, written in a crude, taunting hand. Signed by someone calling himself Jack the Ripper, they claimed responsibility for the killings. The words were laced with contempt for the authorities and disdain for the women he targeted. At first, many dismissed the letters as the work of a hoaxer. But as they kept coming, detailed, insistent, chilling, the police began to take them seriously. One letter in particular carried an eerie authority. It spoke of murders in detail that suggested inside knowledge. More disturbing still was the tone, mocking, almost playful, as though the writer knew he was controlling the narrative. The Yorkshire Ripper had become a phantom on paper, shaping his own legend, while police tried to decipher his handwriting. Then came the tapes. In 1979, authorities received audio cassettes. A man's voice, thick with a Wearside accent, taunted detectives, telling them they would never catch him. The voice called them names, ridiculed their efforts, and declared that he would kill again. It was a new form of psychological warfare. The sound of the voice spread fear not just among the public, but within the ranks of investigators themselves. Detectives latched onto this clue. The accent was distinctive, and resources were funneled into tracing men from the Sunderland area, far from the core of the murders. Thousands of suspects were interviewed, questioned, cleared. The investigation bent around the voice, narrowing its scope, based on the assumption that the killer himself had spoken. For years this belief guided their actions. But the voice was a fraud. The man behind the letters and tapes was not the Yorkshire Ripper at all, but a hoaxer named John Humble, later nicknamed Wearside Jack. His deception misled the police, derailing the investigation at a crucial point. Entire lines of inquiry were abandoned. Genuine witnesses were ignored because their descriptions did not match the accent. Real suspects were dismissed because their voices were different. It is still debated whether investigators were too quick to embrace the recordings. Some argued that the desperation to catch the killer made them vulnerable to any lead that seemed promising. Others believe it was a failure of skepticism, a lapse in critical thinking that allowed a hoaxer to shape the direction of one of the largest manhunts in British history. Meanwhile, the murders continued. Women across Yorkshire lived under curfew-like conditions. Campaigns sprang up urging women to stay home at night, to travel only in groups to avoid certain areas. For many, this felt less like protection and more like punishment, as though society expected women to carry the burden of safety while the killer roamed free. The streets of Leeds and Bradford grew emptier, but fear thickened. What is most unsettling about this period is how close police actually came to the real killer. Peter Sutcliffe had been interviewed multiple times. He matched certain descriptions and his name appeared in files. Yet because his voice did not match the recordings, he was dismissed. Paperwork buried his file under a mountain of other suspects. He walked free, calm, ordinary, blending into the crowd, while investigators wasted precious years chasing a phantom voice. The letters and tapes became part of the Ripper mythos, amplifying the terror, cementing the killer as a figure of mystery and dread. In pubs, factories, and homes, people whispered about the voice, replaying it in their minds, convinced it belonged to the monster who prowled their streets. The hoaxer had succeeded in spreading fear just as effectively as the killer himself. By the time police realized the truth, the damage was irreversible. The killer had grown bolder, striking again and again while the investigation faltered under its own weight. The Yorkshire Ripper was not only taking lives, he was dismantling the very system meant to stop him. The years between 1978 and 1980 were marked by a grim rhythm, ordinary days punctured by sudden acts of horror. Peter Sutcliffe, the man no one yet recognized, continued to stalk the night with unnerving patience. His pattern was by now familiar. Women attacked in the darkness, their lives ended by a hammer's blow or a stabbing frenzy. Yet each murder carried its own awful weight, its own ripple of fear through the communities of northern England. One case that stands out is the murder of Vera Millward. She was 40, a mother of 7, already weakened by illness, when she crossed paths with the Ripper. On a spring evening in 1978, she left Manchester's Royal Infirmary, where she had been receiving treatment. Her body was later found in the hospital grounds, a place that should have been associated with healing. Instead, it became another crime scene, another mark in Sutcliffe's dark trail. The cruelty of it resonated. Attacking a sick woman outside a hospital felt like a deliberate twisting of safety into terror. Investigators and criminologists are still debating whether this choice reflected randomness, convenience, or a deeper layer of sadism. Months later, Josephine Whittaker, just 19 years old, was killed as she walked home from visiting her grandparents. She was not part of the sex trade, not someone living on the margins, but a young woman whose path should have been protected by ordinary routine. Sutcliffe struck in an open space under the night sky with a calmness that suggested he no longer feared discovery. By this point, the sense that no one is safe had hardened into certainty. Then came Barbara Leach, a 20-year-old student attacked near her university. Her murder sent shockwaves through the academic community and beyond. Students who often lived independently for the first time suddenly felt hunted. If a young woman could be taken while walking back to her residence in a busy college town, then the Ripper's reach had no limits. Each of these crimes deepened the psychological warfare. The Ripper was no longer confined to dark alleys or red-light districts. He had begun to intrude into spaces that ordinary citizens considered safe: universities, neighborhoods, hospital grounds. That creeping intrusion, that erasure of safety, was as damaging as the murders themselves. Police efforts intensified, but the weight of the investigation was crushing. Every new murder expanded the case files already a mountain of reports, interviews, and suspect lists. Sutcliffe himself appeared in those lists multiple times, flagged for suspicious behavior, even questioned. He once told officers a story about being out late in his car because of problems with a prostitute. They believed him. His explanations, mundane and delivered without nervousness, disarmed suspicion. What makes this period chilling is the strange blend of boldness and invisibility. Sutcliffe was a man with a steady job as a truck driver, a quiet wife, a modest house. His outward life contained nothing sensational, no flashing signs of monstrosity. He blended into the working-class fabric of Yorkshire. Colleagues remembered him as soft-spoken. Neighbours saw nothing unusual. At home, his wife Sonia maintained her routines, unaware of the double life being carried out in silence. Stranger still were Sutcliffe's compulsions. He often drove aimlessly at night, circling familiar streets, parking his car for long stretches, scanning for women walking alone. His obsession grew, and yet no one who knew him recognized the predator within. It's unsettling to imagine him sitting in his vehicle Hammer, tucked away, calm and watchful, while ordinary life continued around him. In these years, the gap between police and killer grew almost absurd. Officers held photographs of suspects, witness statements describing bearded men in cars, composite sketches that echoed Sutcliffe's face. and still he slipped through their grasp. Investigators believed too strongly in the voice on the tapes, convinced the Ripper must sound like a man from Sunderland. Sutcliffe, with his West Yorkshire accent, didn't fit the profile. The real killer walked away from their scrutiny, while others were chased endlessly, falsely accused, their lives upended. For the public, the dread reached a fever pitch. Women organized protests demanding safer streets. Men, too, began to feel the paranoia, wary of walking alone at night for fear of being mistaken as the killer. The Ripper had become not just a person, but a shadow hanging over all of northern England. He was the late-night whisper, the reason for every locked door and hurried step. Through it all, Sutcliffe kept killing. His ritual remained consistent, brutal in its simplicity. His confidence grew because each crime reaffirmed what he already believed: the police could not catch him. The weight of the investigation by 1979 had reached a level that was almost surreal. Detectives sat in rooms stacked high with paper files, walls lined with photographs, names, addresses, and notes scribbled hastily after interviews. Every scrap of information was logged, typed, and filed. The mountain grew until it was nearly unmanageable: over 5 million separate documents, each one a piece of the puzzle, each one threatening to bury the answers beneath its own volume. What might sound thorough on paper was in practice chaos. Files were mislaid, duplicates created confusion, and crucial details were lost in the shuffle. A name written in one division's report didn't always surface in another. The bureaucratic machine meant to capture order instead generated noise. And through this noise, Peter Sutcliffe slipped his file, overlooked his interviews logged, and then forgotten like raindrops lost in a storm. He was interviewed not once, not twice, but more than 9 separate times. In each, he remained calm, cooperative, unassuming. When asked where he had been on certain nights, he offered answers that seemed plausible. He smiled, he explained, and then he walked away. Each time the officers closed, the file convinced he wasn't their man. And why? Because his voice didn't match the one on the tape. That single error, the hoax they'd clung to, created a blind spot that kept Sutcliffe safe. Meanwhile, Sutcliffe's double life deepened. To his wife Sonia, he was a quiet, somewhat peculiar husband. Their home was small, tidy, and Sonia insisted on routines, neat furniture, a silent orderliness that concealed her husband's hidden obsessions. She was a school teacher, intelligent, reserved, and her relationship with Peter carried an air of detachment. Friends who visited often described the house as cold, more like a museum than a home. Yet Sutcliffe played the role convincingly. He worked steady jobs, driving lorries, delivering goods, earning enough to keep up appearances. He joined friends for drinks, laughed at jokes, offered help when asked. No one looking at him across a pub table could have guessed that in his car, parked outside tools of murder, lay concealed in the boot. That was his brilliance, if the word can be applied to such darkness, the ability to blend into ordinary life while carrying unimaginable secrets. Strange details would later emerge about his private quirks. He hoarded pornography, though not in excess. He had strange habits of driving long distances at night for no clear reason, often returning home in the early hours. And more unsettling, he was prone to sudden, unexplained moods, flashes of irritation that would pass as quickly as they appeared. To most, he seemed eccentric, perhaps odd, but never dangerous. It raises a question that criminologists still wrestle with. How does someone manage to compartmentalize to this extent? Investigators and psychologists continue to debate whether Sutcliffe's outward calm was a mask deliberately maintained, or whether he truly lived in a fractured state of denial. Did he consciously know every moment that he was leading 2 lives, or had he convinced himself that one half, the quiet husband, the worker, was the real Sutcliffe, and the other half was some detached shadow? For the police, those years were a nightmare of pressure. Public anger mounted with every murder, Newspapers printed outrage demanding to know why the monster had not been stopped. Politicians called for answers. Officers worked 12-hour shifts combing through files, re-interviewing suspects, patrolling the streets at night. But the more they worked, the more mistakes crept in. The sheer size of the task overwhelmed them. Leads were mismanaged. Witnesses were interviewed too late. Suspects who should have been scrutinized more closely were dismissed. And all the while, Sutcliffe remained at large. He drove through checkpoints without suspicion. He encountered police officers in casual contexts and chatted amiably. He even joked with them. There are chilling stories of him being stopped for minor traffic issues, questioned briefly, and then waved on hammer and knife, hidden just out of sight. For the public, the atmosphere thickened into something like siege. Women's groups organized marches, furious at being told to stay home after dark. Reclaim the night became a slogan of resistance, a demand that the burden of safety not fall solely on women. Yet the reality was unavoidable. The Ripper had changed the rhythm of life in northern England. Streets emptied earlier. Pub conversations always circled back to him. Parents warned their daughters with a trembling insistence that bordered on panic. Looking back, it feels as though the investigation was cursed by its own size. The more files created, the less manageable they became. The more suspects interviewed, the harder it was to see the connections. And in the center of it all, Sutcliffe continued, ordinary, unnoticed, moving through the fog of bureaucracy like a shadow through smoke. The city streets in northern England during the early 1980s carried an almost unnatural silence. Where once there had been the ordinary rhythms of nightlife, pubs closing, chatter spilling into the cold night air, taxis ferrying patrons home, now there was a tense quiet. Women no longer walked home alone. Groups that might once have stayed out until dawn cut evenings short. It was as though an unseen curfew had been imposed not by law, but by fear. The Yorkshire Ripper had turned daily life into a shadow play where every corner could hide a predator. The press magnified this atmosphere. Headlines screamed with every new murder plastering words like butcher and Ripper strikes again across the front pages. Journalists filled their columns with speculation theories and grisly details that both horrified and fascinated readers. People queued for newspapers, hungry for updates, unwilling to be caught unaware. Every line written became part of a collective script of terror. The public wasn't just reading about the murders, they were living inside them. Radio and television amplified the panic further. Warnings were broadcast, interviews aired with detectives who reassured the public, yet offered little substance. Even late-night comedy shows began referencing the Ripper, a dark cultural shadow looming over everyday conversation. To some, he had become more myth than man, a bogeyman, a phantom prowling the streets of Yorkshire. But this was no myth. Bodies were real, families were broken, and women bore the brunt of both the killer's violence and the societal response. Police advice often focused on telling women to modify their behavior. Stay indoors, don't walk at night, don't go out alone. The weight of responsibility was shifted onto the very people most at risk, as though their lives were the variable that could stop the murders. This sparked outrage. Feminist groups organized marches under the banner Reclaim the Night, a defiant rejection of being forced into hiding. They argued that the streets belonged to everyone, not just men, and that women should not have to surrender their freedom because a killer was on the loose. Placards and chants filled the night air, voices rising against the implication that survival required obedience. These demonstrations were a cultural shockwave, signaling that the Ripper's terror had transcended crime. It was now a catalyst for social conflict. Amid this turmoil, odd stories surfaced, adding strange hues to the grim palette. Taxi drivers in Leeds and Bradford reportedly refused fares from lone women, fearing that giving them a ride might bring suspicion. Parents told daughters to cut their hair short, hoping they might be mistaken for men from a distance. Some women even began carrying makeshift weapons in their handbags, keys between fingers, hairspray bottles clutched like miniature flamethrowers. A grim creativity emerged in response to the fear. And then there were the pranks. Men dressed in dark clothing lurked in alleys to scare women, mocking the climate of dread. Hoax calls poured into police stations, each one claiming knowledge of the killer, each one draining precious time. Some men boasted in pubs, half serious, that they could be the Ripper. The line between paranoia and cruelty blurred, as though the terror itself had become contagious. Police morale sank under the strain. Officers walked the streets at night, but instead of reassurance, their presence seemed to emphasize the danger. Detectives found themselves working 12, 14, even 16-hour days, staring at case files until words lost meaning. They knew the public was losing patience. They knew every failure carried not just professional consequences, but real bloody ones. The longer the Ripper remained free, the more it felt like an indictment of their entire system. Through it all, Sutcliffe moved quietly unnoticed, his life a contradiction. At work, he was reliable. At home, reserved. To neighbours, he was polite, even dull. No one saw a monster in him. That banality became his shield. While police pursued shadows of accents and followed the wrong leads, Sutcliffe lived as though encased in glass, invisible yet present. And so the cycle repeated: headlines, fear, outrage, demands, investigations. The Yorkshire Ripper was no longer just one man. He was an atmosphere, a pressure, a distortion in the air of northern England. People whispered his name as though it carried power. Children heard it and shivered. Parents invoked it as warning. And through the silence of the streets, he hunted still. It was the night of November 1980 when the pattern that had haunted Yorkshire for 5 years began to crack. By then, Sutcliffe had already killed 13 women and brutally attacked several more. The streets were colder, darker, emptier than before, yet still he hunted. The difference now was not his hunger, but his luck, the kind of careless mistake that predators eventually make when they believe themselves invincible. That night, Sutcliffe drove his brown Rover into Sheffield. His wife Sonia was at home, none the wiser, and the tools of his grim ritual were in the boot: a hammer, a sharpened screwdriver, and rope. But what he hadn't accounted for was the increased pressure on the police. With public outrage boiling over, officers had stepped up patrols, particularly targeting red-light districts where several of the murders had taken place. At around 10 o'clock, Sutcliffe picked up a young woman named Olivia Rivers, a sex worker. They drove off together in his car, heading into a quieter street. It was an ordinary maneuver for him, one he'd performed countless times before, but what Sutcliffe didn't realize was that plainclothes officers were watching. When they approached his car, Sutcliffe stayed calm, almost eerily so. The officers, seeing only a man soliciting a sex worker, noted the license plate and asked questions. A routine encounter. Yet what followed was far from routine. The number plate on Sutcliffe's Rover was false. The moment the officers ran the plate, alarm bells rang. Why would an ordinary man in an ordinary car use false registration tags? They arrested him. Not for murder, not yet, but for the minor offense of deceptive plates. At the station, he remained oddly composed, even as officers began digging. It was then that something strange occurred. During questioning, Sutcliffe asked to use the toilet. He was escorted there, watched closely, but what the officers didn't notice until later was that he had discarded incriminating evidence in the lavatory hidden tools he carried with him for killing: the hammer, the screwdriver, the rope. He slipped them away like a magician shedding props. For a moment, fate tilted toward his escape. Without the tools, the arrest might have remained minor, a traffic violation, a night in custody before being released. But the officers, growing increasingly suspicious, returned to the site of his arrest. They combed the area where his car had been parked and found the weapons he had discarded earlier. Blood traces, fibers, the unmistakable signs of a man prepared for violence. It was as though the fog lifted in a single instant. Years of confusion, millions of documents, countless interviews, all of it pointed suddenly to one man, Peter Sutcliffe. At first, detectives struggled with disbelief. He didn't look like the monster they had imagined. He wasn't broad-shouldered, wasn't scarred, wasn't dripping with menace. He looked like a lorry driver, quiet, almost shy. One officer later recalled thinking Sutcliffe looked more like an accountant than a killer. But appearances deceived. Under pressure in the interrogation room, Sutcliffe cracked. He confessed not just to one murder, but to 13. He described the attacks with a chilling precision, recounting dates, places, and victims. What had eluded police for years came spilling out in a steady, unnerving rhythm. Officers who had spent sleepless nights poring over files now sat stunned, realizing the man across the table was the very phantom they had chased in circles. Strange details surfaced in his confession. Sutcliffe insisted that voices had guided him, a divine command, directing him to rid the world of prostitutes. He claimed it had begun years earlier when he heard a voice coming from the headstone of a deceased man while working in a cemetery. To some detectives, it sounded like a pathetic attempt to excuse his cruelty. To others, it hinted at deep psychological fracture. Even now, psychiatrists and criminologists debate whether Sutcliffe truly believed in these voices or whether he invented them as a shield. Regardless, the spell of the Ripper's anonymity was broken. The man who had terrorized a nation, who had walked past police officers unnoticed, who had been interviewed 9 times and released, now sat in custody. News of his arrest spread like fire. Within days, the entire country knew his name. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, was no longer a shadow. His face was on the front page of every newspaper. People stared at his photographs, searching for the monster in his features. Some swore they saw cruelty in his eyes. Others saw only an ordinary man, proof that evil can wear the dullest mask. And yet the relief was complicated. 13 women were dead, their families broken. The capture was too late to save them. Public anger turned not only on Sutcliffe but on the police. Questions echoed in Parliament, in newspapers, in pubs. How could he have been interviewed so many times and overlooked? How could false leads, hoax tapes, and disorganized files blind investigators for so long? The answers were messy, uncomfortable, and incomplete. But one fact was undeniable: the reign of the Yorkshire Ripper had ended. The city streets, while still scarred, would slowly regain their life. The phantom had a name, a face, and a prison cell waiting for him. The trial of Peter Sutcliffe opened in May 1981 inside the imposing stone walls of the Old Bailey in London. After years of fierce speculation and mounting frustration, the moment had finally arrived for the Yorkshire Ripper to face justice. Yet from the beginning, the proceedings carried an unsettling air, as if the line between sanity and savagery had blurred beyond recognition. Sutcliffe appeared calm, almost detached, when brought into the courtroom. He wore glasses, kept his beard neatly trimmed, and moved with the quiet demeanor of a man who might have been anyone's neighbor. For the families of his victims, this ordinariness was almost more unbearable than menace. To see the murderer of their daughters, mothers, sisters, presented as a mild figure, not a beast, was a bitter contradiction. From the outset, Sutcliffe's defense leaned heavily on mental illness. His lawyers argued that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, claiming he heard divine voices commanding him to rid the streets of prostitutes. According to them, his killings were not acts of cruelty but of compulsion, carried out under delusion. They hoped the jury would accept diminished responsibility, sparing him from a life sentence in prison, and instead committing him to a psychiatric hospital. But the prosecution struck back with stark precision. The Crown argued that Sutcliffe knew exactly what he was doing. He had stalked his victims' chosen secluded areas, carried weapons, and cleaned himself afterward. He was deliberate, methodical, and fully aware of the law. To the prosecutors, his claims of voices were a thin veil, a desperate excuse to avoid the weight of justice. One by one, the stories of the dead were retold in the cold light of the courtroom. Families sat in grief-stricken silence as photographs of the victims were displayed, as medical examiners described the brutality of the hammer blows, the stabs, the ferocity of the attacks. The effect was crushing. Some jurors averted their eyes. Others sat frozen, staring into the gulf between evidence and humanity. Yet even within this theatre of law, strange and troubling details continued to emerge. Officers testified about the mishandling of the case, about missed opportunities, about interviews that should have caught Sutcliffe years earlier. The courtroom buzzed with the haunting knowledge that dozens of women might still be alive had the investigation not faltered. Outside, the press hammered the police relentlessly. Every front page screamed of incompetence, of bureaucracy drowning in paperwork, while women bled in the streets. Sutcliffe himself remained eerily composed. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice carried no remorse. In one chilling moment, he admitted that he felt like an instrument of God carrying out punishment against women he considered sinful. For the jurors, this raised an agonizing question: was this delusion, or was it a cold, self-righteous justification? Investigators and criminologists are still debating whether Sutcliffe's so-called voices were genuine hallucinations or a manipulative narrative woven after the fact. The public reaction outside the courtroom was fierce. Protests gathered at the Old Bailey's gates. Feminist groups marched, furious that the police had for years dismissed warnings from women, furious that officers had often described victims in derogatory terms, dividing them into respectable and sex workers instead of treating all as equally worthy of protection. The trial became not just about Sutcliffe, but about the failures of a system that had allowed him to thrive. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury was sent out to deliberate. It did not take them long. When they returned, their verdict was clear guilty on 13 counts of murder, guilty on 7 counts of attempted murder. The defence's plea of diminished responsibility was rejected. Sutcliffe was sentenced to 20 life terms, a sentence so severe it all but ensured he would never walk free. The courtroom erupted in a grim silence. Families wept quietly, relief mixing with anguish. For them, no sentence could return what had been lost. For the wider public, it was a strange, uneven closure. The monster who had haunted the nights of Yorkshire was behind bars, yet the wounds he left behind stretched across entire communities. As Sutcliffe was led away, one journalist described his expression as blank, unreadable, like a man who had just finished an ordinary shift at work. It was that ordinariness, that banality of evil, that would continue to haunt England long after the gavel fell. In the weeks following the conviction, Britain was left not with relief, but with a bitter aftertaste. The Yorkshire Ripper had been caught, yes. He had been tried, sentenced, locked away. But the story did not end there. Instead, the focus shifted outward, away from Peter Sutcliffe himself, and toward the colossal failure of the institutions meant to protect the public. The inquiries began almost immediately. Newspapers carried headlines not just about the killer, but about the police force that had spent nearly 6 years chasing him while he continued to kill. Questions thundered through Parliament. Why had Sutcliffe been interviewed and released 9 separate times? Why had detectives ignored leads that pointed directly at him? Why had the infamous Wareside Jack tape misdirected the investigation for years while the body count climbed? The public anger was raw. For many, it wasn't just about incompetence, it was about prejudice. Time and again it was revealed that officers dismissed the murders of sex workers as less urgent, less serious, almost inevitable casualties of a dangerous profession. Women who survived attacks reported that their testimonies were brushed aside or not believed. The implication was clear: the system had failed to value all lives equally, and that failure had given Sutcliffe the space to continue killing. This fury sparked one of the most significant inquiries in modern British policing. Chief Constable Lawrence Byford led a review that tore into the investigation. His report, though initially suppressed from public release, was damning. It described the police work as inadequate, riddled with missed opportunities, burdened by obsession with false leads and poisoned by stereotyping of victims. Detectives had been so convinced by the hoax tape and letters that they dismissed suspects who didn't match the fake accent, Sutcliffe among them. Byford's words would hang like a permanent shadow over the reputation of British law enforcement. In the streets, the atmosphere was still restless. Reclaim the Night marches grew larger, angrier. Women carried banners not just about fear of the Ripper, but about mistrust of the system itself. The trial had exposed what they already suspected, that the voices of women, particularly working-class women, were too often dismissed. The Ripper had killed 13, but the neglect and arrogance of institutions had multiplied the terror. And amid the grief, there were quieter, stranger notes. Rumours spread in pubs that Sutcliffe's wife Sonia had somehow known of his crimes and kept silent, though no proof ever surfaced. Journalists stalked her tabloid-spun lurid tales, and the court of public opinion weighed heavily against her. Neighbours reported seeing her walking with her head lowered, avoiding eye contact, as though she carried not just shame, but a mark that could never be scrubbed away. Even Sutcliffe himself became a kind of grotesque celebrity. His prison intake photo, that unremarkable face, framed by thick glasses, appeared in papers across the country. People stared at it, trying to find the monster beneath the mild expression. Some claimed they saw it instantly. Others said he looked like any other man on the street. That ambiguity, the ordinariness of the Ripper, unsettled people far more than any mask of brutality could have. Meanwhile, criminologists picked apart the case, arguing late into the night in lecture halls and television studios. Was Sutcliffe a true psychotic, driven by delusions and voices, or was he calculating, coldly aware, using the excuse of madness to soften his punishment? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether his talk of divine command was genuine or simply self-serving theatre. The lack of certainty meant that even as his body was confined behind prison walls, his motives remained slippery, unresolved. In homes across northern England, families tried to stitch their lives back together. Daughters who had lived through their teenage years under the cloud of the Ripper finally walked the streets again, though cautiously. Survivors carried scars, both physical and invisible, through the rest of their lives. Every corner of Leeds, Bradford and Manchester seemed to hold echoes of that long terror. The relief of Sutcliffe's imprisonment could not erase what the years had taken, and so, instead of closure, the conviction left a mirror reflecting back society's own blind spots, its prejudices, its fragility. People realize that monsters do not only exist in the dark, they are also born in the spaces where institutions fail, where voices are silenced, where stereotypes override humanity. The Ripper may have been caught, but the questions he left behind lingered like smoke, impossible to clear from the air. Behind the locked doors of Broadmoor, the story of Peter Sutcliffe entered a new phase. Prison life stripped away the last illusions of control he had once held. No longer prowling the streets, no longer blending into the night, he now lived within the narrow confines of high-security walls. But even here, the shadow of his crimes followed him. Transferred from Parkhurst Prison to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital in 1984, Sutcliffe began his sentence under the claim of severe mental illness. Doctors said he was schizophrenic, haunted by voices. Others suspected that the diagnosis was convenient to shield. Inside Broadmoor, though, what mattered less was what he claimed to hear, and more how others saw him as the Yorkshire Ripper, a name that would never leave him. Other inmates treated him with a mix of hostility and fascination. Murderers, arsonists, and the violently disturbed all knew his name before he arrived. Some looked at him as an almost legendary figure of terror, while others despised him as a coward who preyed on women. It was not long before the attacks began. In one infamous incident, Sutcliffe was slashed across the face with a broken coffee jar by another patient. The wound was deep, leaving him partially blinded in one eye. To some, this was poetic justice. To others, it was proof that even within the walls of Broadmoor, the spectre of his crimes brought him no peace. Over the years, stories from inside trickled out through tabloids and whispers. Staff described him as quiet, withdrawn, often reading the Bible. He took on menial jobs within the hospital, cleaning floors, doing laundry. It was a far cry from the man who once stalked city streets, hammer hidden beneath his jacket. Yet there was always something uncanny about his calm. Some nurses said he could be polite, even soft-spoken, but then they would remember the photographs of his victims, and that polite tone would feel like a mask. The outside world did not forget him either. Journalists fought for scraps of information about his life inside. Every small detail, his meals, his hobbies, his rare conversations, was reported as though it carried some secret clue. For the families of the dead, this constant coverage was salt in a wound. They wanted his name buried, erased, not given oxygen year after year. Yet Sutcliffe remained news. The public's grim fascination with him never faded. Within criminology circles, he became a study in contradictions. Some argued he was the textbook serial killer, methodical, driven by compulsion, escalating in violence until caught. Others pointed to his ordinariness, insisting that he represented the terrifying truth that monsters can look like anyone. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Broadmoor's records reveal a man truly broken by psychosis or simply an evil presence caged, cloaked in the language of medicine. Prison life, however, had stripped him of his power. He was no longer the predator. He was a patient vulnerable to the anger of other men locked up with him. Each attack he suffered reminded the public that he was not untouchable. Over time, the violence against him became a strange kind of spectacle in itself. People read the headlines, "Yorkshire Ripper slashed in Broadmoor," and nodded with grim satisfaction as if each blow in the hospital halls could somehow balance the horror of the past. Yet for all the bloodshed and punishment behind bars, one thing remained constant. Sutcliffe never expressed true remorse. Interviews, smuggled conversations, and occasional reports all pointed to the same chilling fact. He acknowledged his crimes, but there was no weight in his words, no sorrow, no apology that carried depth. It was as if he had stepped into a detached narrative, forever recounting his actions like facts in a ledger without humanity attached. Meanwhile, Sonia, his wife, filed for divorce in 1994. For more than a decade, she had lived under the shadow of his name, facing scrutiny, whispered suspicions, and relentless press attention. By finally breaking away, she tried to rebuild a life outside the ruins of his. For many, it was a reminder that Sutcliffe's destruction was not limited to those he killed. The ripples of his violence stretched outward, warping the lives of anyone connected to him. Broadmoor became his cage, but it also became the stage on which the world continued to project its unresolved questions. Was he insane? Was he calculating? Did he believe in the voices he claimed spoke to him, or was that merely a convenient escape route he clung to when the net tightened? Decades later, the debates continue, the unease lingers. Because even locked away, the Yorkshire Ripper was never truly silenced. By the late 1980s, the shockwaves of the Yorkshire Ripper case had hardened into something more enduring reform. The horror of Sutcliffe's crimes had forced Britain to stare uncomfortably at its own systems, and what stared back was a reflection of neglect, prejudice, and a police force in desperate need of modernisation. The Byford report, kept hidden from the public for years, was a brutal indictment. It detailed failure after failure, officers interviewing Sutcliffe 9 times and letting him walk, detectives discarding credible evidence because it didn't align with the Wareside Jack hoax, case files piling up until leads went cold. Byford's conclusion was unmistakable: the investigation had been inadequate at almost every level. That phrase burned itself into the legacy of British policing. But beyond the pages of official documents, something more vital had shifted. Communities, particularly women, no longer trusted the system in the same way. For years, the police had framed the killings through the lens of morality, implying that sex workers were the main targets, as if their lives carried less value. When Sutcliffe began killing women who weren't sex workers, panic surged because the danger was suddenly universal. That double standard had left a bitter taste. Out of that bitterness, movements grew. The Reclaim the Night marches spread across Britain, demanding safer streets and equality in how the lives of women were protected. For the first time, these protests connected policing failures to deeper social prejudice. It wasn't just about one killer. It was about how violence against women was treated as background noise until it threatened the respectable. People carried banners through the cold night air, chanting not only against Sutcliffe, but against a culture that had allowed him to thrive in the shadows. Within the police, reforms slowly emerged. Task forces were retrained, record-keeping was overhauled, and systems were developed to ensure that serial offences were tracked more carefully across regions. The days of detectives relying on instinct, personal hunches, and scattered notebooks were giving way to computerized databases and coordinated strategy. Sutcliffe's case had shown what happened when obsession with a false lead consumed an investigation, leaving truth overlooked in plain sight. The media, too, carried lessons, though in fractured ways. Some journalists acknowledged how sensational coverage had fueled myths about the case, especially the obsession with Wareside Jack. Others continued to exploit every scrap of Ripper-related news for circulation, ensuring Sutcliffe's name never really faded. This tension between exploiting horror and confronting systemic flaws became part of the story itself. In living rooms across the north, the memory of those years lingered. Mothers warned daughters not to walk alone at night. Fathers accompanied children to bus stops even years after Sutcliffe was locked away. The legacy of fear was not erased by his capture. It lived on in habits, in cautious glances, in the way entire communities restructured their daily lives. Survivors of his attacks spoke quietly about their scars, but their words were often drowned out by the louder noise of institutional blame and public outrage. Stranger still were the odd cults of fascination that arose. Letters flooded into Broadmoor from people wanting to correspond with Sutcliffe. Some expressed morbid curiosity, others offered sympathy, and a few wrote with twisted admiration. It was proof that notoriety has its own magnetism, and that for some, even monsters behind bars draw light. For many ordinary Britons, this was an unsettling reminder. The Ripper was not only a figure of terror, but disturbingly a figure of fascination in a culture that consumed crime as spectacle. And through it all, one question continued to hang in the air. Could it happen again? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether reforms sparked by Sutcliffe truly built a safer system, or whether the same blind spots linger beneath new technology and new language. The case had forced progress, yes, but it had also revealed how deeply bias and oversight could run. In the end, the Yorkshire Ripper's most lasting wound may not have been the lives he stole, as devastating as that was, but the way his actions exposed cracks in the very structures designed to protect society. The terror of his hammer and knife was finite bound to the years he walked free. But the lessons carved from his crimes about prejudice, about power, about who society listens to and who it ignores, those lessons remain etched into Britain's conscience. As the years dragged into decades, Peter Sutcliffe's story entered its final act. Time, which had once been his ally during those nights of stalking and waiting, now worked against him inside Broadmoor and later within the prison walls of Frankland. The passage of years chipped away at his body, but not at the infamy of his name. He had become something more than a man and less a figure frozen in the public imagination, reduced to a grim label, the Yorkshire Ripper. In 2001, after more than 15 years in Broadmoor, doctors declared him fit to serve the rest of his life in a mainstream prison. He was moved to HMP Frankland, a high-security prison in County Durham, known among inmates as Monster Mansion. Here he joined the ranks of Britain's most reviled criminals, surrounded by others whose names inspired fear. Yet even among them, Sutcliffe carried a special notoriety. Prisoners despised him not only for the brutality of his crimes, but also because his victims were women. To harm the vulnerable, even in a world of killers, was seen as cowardice. He lived in a constant state of risk. The attacks followed him. In 2007, he was stabbed in the face with a pen by another inmate. It was another reminder that even within cages, predators remain prey to their own history. Guards described him as quiet, almost ghost-like in routine. He read the Bible, often carried himself with an air of detachment, but nothing in his demeanor ever convinced anyone that remorse had taken root. Meanwhile, the outside world had moved forward, but his name remained a dark echo. Books, documentaries, and endless news specials revisited his crimes, each trying to frame the narrative anew. In British culture, his shadow lingered on screen in whispered conversations, in the way parents reminded daughters of old dangers. He was both history and presence, an uninvited guest at the table of memory. In 2015, Sutcliffe was reportedly deemed no longer mentally ill, a decision that stirred debate. Was he ever truly schizophrenic, or had that diagnosis been a way to remove him from the harsher environment of prison in the 1980s? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those early medical assessments were genuine or a convenient misunderstanding. The controversy reflected a larger question that never found an answer. Was Peter Sutcliffe insane, or was he simply evil? By 2020, the end was near. The man who once roamed Yorkshire's streets in the dead of night now struggled with diabetes, heart disease, and near blindness. He was an old figure, frail and ailing, nothing like the predator who once terrorized entire cities. In November of that year, he contracted COVID-19. The virus that had swept across the globe reached into his prison cell, and soon his body gave way. On November 13, 2020, Peter Sutcliffe died at the age of 74. There was no national mourning, no collective sorrow. His death was greeted with headlines stripped of sentiment. For the families of victims, the news brought complicated emotions. Some felt a grim sense of closure. Others said his death changed nothing, that their loved ones were still gone, their lives stolen decades earlier. In Yorkshire, candles were lit not for him, but for those whose names should never have been overshadowed by his. Even in death, Sutcliffe left questions behind. What had really driven him? Could more have been done to stop him earlier? Did the justice system ever truly understand him? Scholars and criminologists continue to debate the psychology behind his crimes, dissecting his life as though somewhere in its fragments lies a key to prevention. Yet perhaps the most haunting truth is that even after 40 years, the answers remain elusive. For the world, the Yorkshire Ripper was gone. But his ghost, the fear he cultivated, the lessons his case forced upon society, those remained flickering in memory, as chilling as ever. Long after Peter Sutcliffe's body was buried, his shadow lingered. In Britain's collective memory, the Yorkshire Ripper was not just a name, it was a scar. For those who had lived through the late 1970s, his crimes were more than newspaper headlines. They were curfews, silent streets, and nights of fear, where footsteps behind you meant the world could end in an instant. That atmosphere never truly vanished. The cultural echo began almost immediately. Plays, television dramas, books, and later streaming documentaries revisited the case again and again. Some examined the police failures in almost forensic detail, treating them as cautionary tales. Others focused on Sutcliffe himself, turning his life into the dark subject of psychological exploration. Yet the loudest voices of protest always came from the families of his victims, who felt their daughters' names had been erased under the heavy weight of his infamy. Each time his story returned to the spotlight, their grief was forced open, like an old wound. In Yorkshire, the memory of those years carried a bitter undercurrent. Pubs that once hosted whispered rumours still bear the silence of those nights. Survivors, women who endured his attacks but lived, spoke with courage about the scars he left, both physical and unseen. Their testimony became a vital counterpoint to the obsession with Sutcliffe himself. They insisted that the narrative was not about him, but about resilience. They lived on, even if the world sometimes forgot them. The case reshaped how society viewed violence against women. Feminist movements pointed out that the media and police, by framing victims as sex workers or respectable women, had reinforced dangerous hierarchies of worth. Outrage led to change. Reclaim the Night marches became annual rituals, lantern-lit processions through British cities where women demanded streets that were safe regardless of the time of night or the choices they made. These marches were acts of defiance against Sutcliffe's memory, reclaiming the darkness he once ruled. Stranger still was how Sutcliffe's crimes seeped into the background of everyday culture. Musicians referenced him in lyrics, crime shows used him as a symbol of terror, and writers of fiction borrowed his silhouette to create characters that haunted their novels. He became shorthand for unspeakable violence, a cultural bogeyman lurking at the edge of Britain's imagination. And yet this fascination revealed something unsettling. The line between remembering as warning and remembering as spectacle is thin. Even children born decades after his arrest grew up hearing fragments of the story passed down like folklore. "Don't walk home alone," parents warned. "The Ripper's gone, but others like him exist." His name became part of a vocabulary of caution, a reminder of how fragile safety can be. But the lessons drawn from his case were not only cultural. Academics dissected it in criminology lectures, pointing to the botched investigation as an example of confirmation bias, poor resource management, and the dangers of overlooking marginalized communities. Police training evolved to include scenarios designed to prevent the same blind spots from repeating. Yet, investigators and detectives are still debating whether the modern system, despite its databases and surveillance tools, can ever fully erase the human tendency to cling to flawed assumptions. And so, Sutcliffe's presence remains both historical and current. Each retelling is both a confrontation and a risk of repetition. Britain learned, but Britain also remembered, replaying the story like a haunting refrain. What lingered most was not just the fear, but the question, how could a man like this move unseen for so long in plain sight? The Yorkshire Ripper was dead, but his shadow stretched long, woven into culture, into memory, into the very fabric of how Britain talks about crime and safety. The end of the story is not written in the violence of Sutcliffe's acts, nor in the countless hours of investigation that tracked him across Yorkshire. It lies in the quiet spaces left behind, in the families who still light candles, in the women who walk through city streets at night with a sharper awareness of their surroundings, and in the lessons carried forward by every detective who opens a new file. The Yorkshire Ripper is gone, but the ripples of his life and death spread outward, touching generations who never even heard his name spoken in real time. For the police, his case remains one of both shame and progress. It is remembered as a warning of what happens when prejudice and tunnel vision cloud judgment. Mistakes cost lives. Yet it is also remembered as a catalyst for change, the reason why Britain modernized its investigative techniques, improved communication between departments, and began to understand the importance of treating all victims as equals. For survivors, the passage of decades has been uneven. Some built new lives, but the memory of what was taken never dulled. Others chose silence, living with private scars that never needed retelling. Their existence reminds us that the story of crime is never just about the criminal, it is about the people who endure, whose strength continues long after headlines fade. And for the public, Sutcliffe became something like a mirror. His crimes forced society to ask what it values, how it protects, and how it speaks about women. Even in death, he left questions unanswered. Was he truly delusional or simply cruel? Did his arrest come too late, or was his capture inevitable from the start? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Sutcliffe's pathology offers any new insight, or whether he was just another man who chose violence because he could. What remains certain is that his victims should not be forgotten. Their names, their faces, their stories deserve more space than his shadow ever did. They were the lives that stitched together the true fabric of Yorkshire, and it is for them that the story must be told, not to glorify him, but to remember them. And so the narrative closes not with spectacle, but with silence. A silence for the lost, a silence for the lessons learned too late, a silence that belongs to the night, once stalked by fear, now reclaimed by those who refuse to live in its shadow. Now, as the final image fades, imagine the dark streets of Yorkshire quiet once more. Street lamps buzz, autumn leaves scatter across empty pavements, and somewhere behind a lit window, families gather safe and together. The terror that once walked among them has ended. What lingers now is remembrance, and the calm that comes after. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper is finished here, but the world holds countless others. Some mysteries remain locked in shadows, waiting for the right moment to surface. Others have already been solved, leaving behind lessons etched in grief. Each one carries its own weight, its own strange detail that unsettles the quiet of ordinary life. Perhaps the next case takes us to the cobblestone streets of London, where a series of disappearances baffled detectives and terrified neighborhoods. Or maybe it leads across the ocean into the silent forests of America, where missing hikers left behind nothing but half-told clues. Each is a thread weaving together the vast tapestry of crime memory and unanswered questions. These stories remind us of how fragile human safety can be, and how the line between the ordinary and the terrifying is thinner than we ever imagine. They remind us that even when a mystery is solved, the echo of fear lingers whispering across years and places. So if you're still awake, stay close. There is more to uncover, more voices to hear, more shadows to walk through carefully together. The night is long, the world is wide, and the stories, well, the stories are never truly finished